Welcome to a very brief lecture here on the microscopic anatomy of bone tissue, as well as the chemical composition of our bones. When we start with microscopic anatomy, we have to look at the cells that we find in bone tissue, right? All of our various osteocytes of one form or another. There are 5 major types of cells that we find in our bone tissue. They all start off as kind of the same basic cell, so a stem cell, originator cell, that's that osteogenic cell, and then they kind of differentiate depending on kind of where they are, what they do. But they all are all of the same origin, and that is that osteogenic cell, right? Genesis, formation of. And so that is our kind of undifferentiated stem cell. And all of the other cell types start off as this osteogenic cell. Some of these osteogenic cells will remain as osteogenic cells kind of constantly in the bone, so that we always have kind of a small pool of stem cells that can kind of grow and differentiate and develop into the other cell types. Our osteoblast cells, right? Osteobone, blast, an immature cell. So this cell is the one that is actually responsible for actually making the extracellular matrix. So when we create new bone tissue, when we make new bone tissue because we're growing, for instance, the cell type that is responsible for kind of extruding the fibers and making the kind of proteoglycan glue that's the extracellular matrix, that is this osteoblast cell. As these osteoblasts mature, they'll become osteocytes, full-fledged, like kind of quote-unquote adult cells, and they maintain and monitor the matrix. They don't really make it, but they do kind of clean up and maintenance type work. We also have what we call bone lining cells, which are found either endosteal cells inside or periosteal cells outside, that work with the osteocytes in order to help the osteocytes do their job. The other major cell type that we have is this big multinucleate osteoclast cell. And you'll see it has a lot of, it's huge for one, it's very multinucleate. It's a fusion of several other cells. It also has this kind of ruffled appearance because that creates more surface area in order to pack these kind of little fingers with lysosomes and enzymes that can actually break down bone tissue. And so the osteoclast cell is our resorping cell. It's the cell that actually breaks bone tissue down. And bone resorption, the breakdown of particularly kind of older or damaged bone tissue, is actually a normal part of our kind of physiological bone processes, as we'll talk about in a little bit. Once we've gotten past kind of the cell types in microanatomy, then we have to look at we have to go back to the macroanatomy for a minute. And that's the compact bone, kind of smooth and dense, and then the spongy bone. Because let's look at what the compact bone and the spongy bone look like microscopically. Compact bone has a very, very specific arrangement in terms of the structure of the extracellular matrix and the collagen fibers. It's called an osteon, sometimes known as the Haversian system, for this central canal through which blood vessels and nerves will run. That central canal is known as a Haversian canal, and so when you look at compact bone in lab, it looked like tree rings, right? And that central canal is the Haversian canal that's like the center of the tree. So osteons are basically a hollow tube. That tube is the canal, again, through which blood vessels and nerves will run. And it's layers upon layers of collagen fibers and extracellular matrix bone tissue. Those layers are called lamellae. That's the kind of Latin word for layers. And if you look at the diagram here, you'll see that the collagen fibers run in alternating directions depending on kind of the layer of the ring. What that allows compact bone to do is withstand what we call torsion, which are twisting forces. So whenever, if you were to like grab one of the bones in lab and you would try to twist it, it would be very hard to twist it that way and break it that way because of these kind of alternating layers, lamellae, of the collagen fibers, alternating, one layer running left, the other next layer running right, left, right, so on and so forth. So it makes compact bone very strong. If we look at our central canal, because that's what you're looking at here, is we kind of looked in the middle of a central canal, you'll see again nerves, arteries, veins, all the blood vessels and nerves running. But connecting the central canals of various osteons, so here we are looking at the compact portion of, I think this looks like a femur, yeah. Then the central canals of each osteon are then also connected by perforating canals, and that's these here, and they're allowing blood vessels and nerves to kind of communicate between the osteons. Here's our central canal. So again, blood vessels, and then again, to me it totally looks like a tray with like the tray rings. And each layer, you'll see the lacunae, the little cups, and then the osteocytes sitting in the little lacunae cups. We also have what we call so the lamellae around the central canal are called concentric lamellae because they're concentric and they're around, right? Concentric is around. We also have what we call circumferential lamellae, and that's these layers here that actually don't belong to an osteon, but that actually wrap around the whole kind of exterior of the bone. And you can see there's our periosteum. And then sometimes what we'll also have, I don't know if you can see any in this image, but what we call interstitial lamellae, and it's kind of the lamellae like right here or here that really aren't part of an osteon but aren't the circumferential lamellae, and they're essentially just leftovers from remodeled, previously existing osteons. So you want to be kind of, it's a lot of terminology, and that can get a little kind of difficult to kind of wrap around, but make sure you're comfortable with the compact bone structure. And we have a couple of really awesome models in lab that'll help you kind of look at these layers. And again, you can see here's the kind of concentric tubes of bone tissue. They've pulled it out so you can see. Spongy bone has a very different structure microscopically. And in fact, spongy bone in an adult is actually what your bones look like as they develop in utero. So the key feature for the spongy bone, of course, are the trabeculae, these kind of flat pieces of bone. Well, the neat thing about the bone trabeculae is that they tend to line up along stress points, almost like the trusses in a bridge, so that whilst spongy bone is not nearly as hard and strong as compact bone, by arranging the trabeculae along stress points, it does add a little bit of strength to our spongy bone. No osteons. We still have lamellae, but they're not in those nice, neat concentric circles. You can still see lacunae with the osteocytes sitting in them. That'll be connected by little canuliculi. You'll see them in the compact bone too, little canals. And then you'll see in the kind of spaces of the spongy bone, lots and lots of red bone marrow, so that we can have developing blood cells. So spongy bone, very, very different microscopically than compact bone. And since they're different structurally microscopically, they're also different structurally macroscopically. When we look at the kind of organic and non-organic portions of the bone, that's what we talk about when we talk about chemical composition. What is in the bone? Some of it is organic, some of it is not organic, which is kind of unlike some of our other tissues and organs, because it's all mostly organic. But bones have some non-organic components too. The organic components are all of the cells. So all of the osteoblasts, all the osteocytes, all the cell types, right? They're all organic because they're animal cells. It's also something that we call the osteoid, which is that extracellular matrix that's made by those osteoblasts. So it's all of our ground substance, the proteoglycans, the glycoproteins like the glue, and then the collagen fibers. And if we're talking about collagen fibers in compact bone, they're of course going to be different structurally than in terms of their arrangement than we just saw with the spongy bone. Now, the osteoid, the organic part of our bone, is responsible for, of course, the overall kind of structure, but it's also why bones are flexible. And I know that's really kind of a weird way to think about bone. We think of hard bone, but they are flexible. They have what they call tensile strength, right? Tensile strength is like when you pull on something and it doesn't really have a lot of give. And that is, by and large, the function of the osteoid, and particularly the collagen fibers. So when we talk about the resilience of bone, what we're talking about is not like the strength of a bone, and that's a common misperception, that resilience is strength. Resilience is the ability to cope. So despite whatever stresses that we put on a bone, it can kind of just deal with it. The same could be said of people, right? Resilient people are able to cope with stresses. The reason bones are so resilient is because of the collagen fibers. The collagen in bone tissue makes what we call sacrificial bonds, meaning they can snap really easily, but then they can also knit back together really easily. We're talking about the bonds between individual collagen molecules. If you were to, say, think of maybe like a football player or something, right? Quarterback gets sacked and gets knocked on the ground because somebody like barreled into him. All of the weight of that kind of stress is on one point of the bone. And if it wasn't for these collagen fibers and these sacrificial bonds, all of the weight would be at that one specific point. But because the sacrificial bonds between the collagen molecules can essentially stretch and kind of just break apart when they're impacted, the energy of that impact gets spread out over a larger area. And so that helps fractures from occurring. Of course, now depending on the size of the impact, it might not matter. The bone may still break. But I mean, think about all the times people do crazy things that don't result in injuries to their bones, and that is because of these sacrificial bonds. Now, assuming no trauma kind of occurs again, then the bonds between the collagen molecules will essentially just reform and kind of knit back together. And so it makes bones very, very, very resilient. But bones are also very, very hard. And the reason our bones are hard and strong is due not to the organic components, but to the inorganic parts of the bone. And it's what we call hydroxyapatites, mineral salts. It's about 65% of the mass of a bone is just in these calcium phosphate crystals that essentially pack in and around all of the collagen fibers in the extracellular matrix. And this is what makes our bones really, really hard. It also makes them really resistant to compression, right? If you were to stick a bone in between your two hands and try to squeeze it, you're not going to be able to snap it. It's really, really, really hard. And in fact, bone is about half as strong as steel in resisting that kind of compressive forces, and actually as strong as steel in resisting kind of tension forces, kind of pulling forces. So it's kind of cool to think about that. I mean, we use steel to make skyscrapers and ships, and yet your bones are, just as strong as they are in some instances, which is really pretty cool. The calcium phosphate crystals are also why bones last so long. I was lucky enough several years ago to see Lucy, the Australopithecus skeleton that's part of our kind of evolutionary lineage. And the Lucy skeleton, I think, is something like 4,000 years old, and yet the skeleton is still intact. And that's because of these mineral salts and these kind of calcium phosphate crystals. So that's the end of this lecture. If you have any questions, always feel free to ask.